All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Your Folk Radio. This is the Restoration Hour, where we try to restore our heritage as a white Christian civilization and the U.S. Constitution. Today we're going to be talking, first of all, feudalism, and then the transition from feudalism to, how should I put it, actually Bolshevism. So we'll make a transition from feudalism to Khazaria during our interview. So how are you doing, Matt Johnson?
Oh, I'm doing it. Out here, I don't know how it is where you are, but in Pittsburgh, it's like 70 degrees today.
Okay.
What the hell's going on in this world?
Right.
It was 20 degrees. It was 20 degrees a few days ago. Weather-wise, there's like one weekend in November. I'm happy, and that's pretty much about it.
Yeah. Well, 20 degrees is coming right up on you, man, because that's how cold it is here in Chicago, and it almost started snowing today. So our weather precedes your weather by about a day. Right. So,
yeah, that's right. That's right. It's the same stream. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what's coming up for you tomorrow. So you just deal with it. Deal with it, bro.
Right. I live in Alaska any day of the week.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's times where Alaska is warmer than Chicago, so they're not complaining. All right.
It's also, as you say, it's also very white and very civilized. Two things that I'm a big fan of.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. All right. So I stumbled upon your book, The Third Rome, which deals with feudalism. It's primarily Russian feudalism, but I thought we would introduce the subject in a more general way. There's a website called Antonius Aquinas, which I thought was very good because I get sick and tired of hearing left-wing / liberal skeptics and complainers about white civilization dumping on feudalism, which after I had studied it after a while, I determined was not so bad. But it's pretty much like anything else, even slavery in the South. You could have a very kind and gentle slave master, or you could have a very wicked one, right? And so that's how I perceive both Russian feudalism and French feudalism, until they got to the point where they started to becoming degenerate, although the Russian feudalism did not become very degenerate in my view. Maybe you can correct me on that score. And this website says, one of the biggest misconceptions held among the independent and alternative media is that of feudalism and the political, economic, and social arrangements which characterized that unfairly maligned epoch. Derogatory language is often used to describe feudal times, with commentators often suggesting that today's political and financial elites seek to return mankind to such supposedly depressed, stagnant, and repressive condition. Well, that second sentence is true, but it's not just the social elites, it's also the Bolsheviks who are trying to bring back feudalism as disguised as communism. So what would your general characterization of feudalism be? Because I think this is a fairly reasonable comment here.
Well, the Middle Ages have been a huge area of mine for 25 years now.
Okay.
Both East and West, meaning Eastern and Western Europe, two very, very different civilizations. I'm uncomfortable using the word feudalism to cover them both.
Okay.
Because a good definition of feudalism is what happens when central authority breaks down, and political power gets decentralized. It's not even political anymore. It becomes privatized. Okay. And smaller landowners join up with bigger ones for the sake of mutual protection. The great advantage of this in the West, we're really talking about the Carolingian era.
Okay.
That's really, and that's it. Because once power is restored in the central government, feudalism is less and less relevant. But you had this cross-section of authorities. So at any given moment, you had a monastery, you had a parish, you had a bishop, very powerful. You had a city or urban people. You had your landlord. You had the monarch, who often was irrelevant, but still occasionally can be powerful. All of these authorities crisscrossing all the time. Mm-hmm. So it was a tremendous check and balance system.
Okay, so was this by design or it just worked out that way? checks and balances?
This is what happens. This is what human beings do.
Okay.
Central authority breaks down. You had a relatively, half barbarian, half Roman population, not bad stock to work with, and you had memories of old Rome still in central France, and it's really just how it worked out. But at the same time, there's a certain sense to it. There was no such thing as a central authority. There's no such thing as an all power. Even when monarchy was restored, even under Charlemagne, he didn't have a day-to-day authority over a peasant commune. He dealt with general issues of taxation, which came from nobles, and military policy. Otherwise, that was it. Yeah. There was no capital city. The capital city went where he went.
So
there was no bureaucracy of any kind whatsoever.
Okay, so there wasn't, if I'm reading you correctly, there's no overbearing centralized government that hovering over the people's lives like we have today.
That would be a great place to start to define feudalism, because feudalism centers around the decentralization, forced dispersion of political authority in the hands of different authority. I like the word authority over power, because power is just, coercion. Authority is the right to use coercion. So you had authorities more than power.
Okay.
You take one peasant anywhere, and like I say, you had 5 or 6 authorities over him that could play off against each other, and don't count that out as far as a checks and balance origin, because it just made a lot of sense.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, here, let me just quote one more item here from this article, which I think speaks to what you just said. Germany remained for the longest time an area of decentralized political authority, the two words you just used, as Professor Stevenson explains, quote, from the Rhineland to the Slavic frontier, armies were made up of knights. Society was dominated by a chivalrous aristocracy. The countryside was dotted with motte and bailey castles, and governments were organized on the basis of feudal tenure. If the lord needed military service or financial aid beyond what was specifically owed by his vassals, his only recourse was to ask them for a voluntary grant. He had no right to tax or assess them arbitrarily, for his authority in such matters was determined by feudal contract. That's interesting, because the impression I've always gotten from critics of feudalism was this was an overbearing, centralized dictatorship.
Give the person my number, because he's illiterate. Feudalism, another way, I always thought in the Russian sense and in the Byzantine sense, is the Byzantines never had feudalism, but they use it in a way. It's the guarantee of land to peasant families.
Okay.
That's a more Russian definition of the term. That's where it came from. The peasant was connected to the land. You couldn't move the peasant without the land. He was guaranteed to have it. And during the time of troubles in Russia, early 17th century, as always what happens when things break down, bigger landlords get bigger because you go into them for protection. Well, after Boris Godunov, or even under Boris Godunov, they made sure that this was impossible, because big landlords were taking away labor from smaller ones, and this was not a good thing. And because they're always the monarch is always at war with nobles. They despise each other. They're two totally different things.
Okay,
if you've read Master of Rome, that's the whole concept.
Okay, so, quick question: how did the bigger landlords take labor away from the smaller ones?
Because they had more resources, they could offer better deals.
Okay.
This is very contract oriented. This is very law oriented. But when I say law, I mean custom,
right?
Which was certainly more important. Written laws were, when you read these written law codes from back then, it's really boring reading because they're so general.
Yeah.
They generally deal with the day to day was done by the communal arrangements, largely religiously based. That's really where the authority came from. So because they had more money, they had more people, they could offer better terms.
Yes.
And so they were taking labor away from smaller landlords, and that's really where Russian feudalism comes from.
Okay, so the feudalistic system, was that like a check against the greater power of the larger feudal lords? Is that how the feudalism emerged?
That's a great way of putting it.
Okay.
That was when Peter the Great returned from Europe, whether or not it was the same man, I did a whole broadcast. I don't think it was the same man who came back, bringing all these foreigners, high-ranking Freemasons back to Russia. Everything changed. Mm-hmm. And the 18th century saw the introduction of the worst forms of centralized government with the worst forms of feudalism. And thank the 19th century, that was put right. And then Russia ended up having the best of both. Right. But in the 18th century in Russia was a very, very dark time, a revolutionary time. And, you had essentially foreigners running the country.
Really? Foreigners? How'd they get involved?
Well, coming from Peter, it really is so short. I mean, Catherine the Great didn't speak Russian very well.
Oh, neither did Lenin.
Right. The two Annas didn't speak Russian very well. They were about as orthodox as my cats are. Yeah. Freemasonry was everywhere. Foreigners were brought in. Peter the Great was a demonist. Wow. He wrote odes, which I've read. He wrote odes to Dionysius, and he would march through Petersburg, which was the Gnostic floating city he named after himself, blaspheming all his drunken people, an army of people, singing these songs that he wrote. Some of them still survive, to Dionysius and the Maenads and everything else. Sometimes he'd be naked. Yeah, he was off his nut.
Right.
But militarily, he did well. And it really doesn't matter what you do. If you win wars, you're going to stay in power.
Right.
But the Petrine state was a complete perversion. He covered it with the old Roman gods and everything else. It really was a pagan Gnostic symbol, and quite literally built on the bones of the Cossacks, which is a symbol for him, because they were used as forced labor to build this. And so it was literally built on top of their bones in the most ridiculous, inhospitable part of the world, which was an old Gnostic trick to be able to dominate nature. And bringing all these Masons in from Great Britain, he completely revolutionized at least the city. I mean, Russian tradition was banned in St. Petersburg. You couldn't wear beards. Russian dress was forbidden. It was meant to be a foreign city. That's why he left Moscow.
So he was a liberal. Peter the Great was a liberal, is what you're saying.
Culturally speaking, yes. Culturally speaking, he was secular. Uh-huh. He was sexually liberated. Let's put it that way.
Interesting.
And, as was Catherine the Great. Well, let me put it like this: his first wife was a very holy, very good woman, Eudoxia. Okay. When this person came back from Northern Europe, his so-called Great Embassy, he shut her away in a monastery.
Wow.
She was convinced that it wasn't him, because he didn't even recognize her. So then he took, on one of his campaigns in Northern Europe, he took a serf girl named Marta, who his officers had passed around for a few days, already an alcoholic. I guess she was good looking, I don't know. And as a way to mock the throne, he made her Empress Catherine I.
Oh, wow.
She was illiterate. She didn't know where she was most of the time. The nobles, of course, ran the country, and she died of cirrhosis of the liver after a short time. So that's the kind of, when I say liberal, yeah, this is the kind of crap we're talking about. The French revolutionaries put the whore of Babylon on the throne of the Bishop of Paris.
Oh, yeah.
That was his way of spitting at Russian tradition.
Yeah. Okay, so Peter himself then, sounds like what you're saying is he was a degenerate in a very, very conservative era. And to what extent did the boyars or the other nobles follow his example? Did this become common, like in the French court, or no?
He created his own nobility, mostly foreign. The Petersburg world, he created an entirely new bureaucracy, a new set of ranks. He wanted to eliminate the old Muscovite nobility.
Yeah, I see.
And the rebellion, there were numerous rebellions, some of them huge. But the Old Believers, which I have a book on the Old Believers, which are the traditionalist Orthodox, numbered about 30 million at the time.
Wow.
Okay. The official Orthodox Church, they were good people, but he purged the church no different than Lenin did. No different. He just didn't have he tortured and murdered his own son, which is another bit of evidence that it really wasn't him.
Right.
He was a,
he was a rocker. Peter the rocker.
And people really people thought that he was, if it was him, he was possessed because he didn't sleep. He walked so fast. He was almost 7 feet tall, which was a freak at the time.
Ooh, yeah.
That's not the guy who left Russia, though. The embassy that left Russia to visit the capitals of Western Europe, all those Russians never returned. A handful returned with a Peter that didn't look like the old one and was like 6 inches taller.
Right.
His own wife. So he came back understanding to create a Masonic revolution in the country. But he didn't convince anybody except his new bureaucracy that slowly took over. But that was reintegrated to some extent in the 19th century. There was some, and his daughter, Elizabeth, was probably the only good ruler of the 18th century. But the 19th century was different. Starting with Paul, you had one excellent ruler after another for all their flaws. They were excellent. So they attempted to reintegrate Peter's system with old Russia, and to a great extent they succeeded.
Okay. All right, well, take us back to Ivan the Terrible. In your book, The Third Rome, I'm going to be quoting here from page 55, and then maybe you could quickly tell people how they can get a copy of this book after I read the quote. As a boy, the Tsar apparently was placed in what was essentially solitary confinement. The scions of the noble families of Russia would come to his room and mock him, taunting him with the power they had and were soon to acquire at the expense of his family. At the age of 13, Ivan took the throne and immediately executed one of his chief tormentors and subversives, the scion of the extremely powerful Shuisky family, Andrei. Okay, so maybe you can, first let us know how people can get a copy of this book, which I found fascinating, and maybe you can provide some more details for this quote. Back to you.
Okay, it's published by the Barnes Review. Oh, okay. I was editor of the Barnes Review at the time when I wrote it, and Willis Carto gave me generous time off to work on it, and I loved the man. It was a shame when he died.
Okay,
he's very good to me, but. And it's still for sale now. I was 29 when I wrote it. I was young. There's certain things I wouldn't say today. I was angry when I wrote it, as you could probably figure out.
Right.
What the book was you read The Third Rome, and it's an outline of what the rest of my life is going to be like, intellectually speaking. And it's true. I've kept to that.
Okay.
You can't do a history of Russia, in 250 pages. It's an outline. Right. It's a way to take our point of view and apply it to Russia in the most general sense. And then, of course, I spending the rest of my life now filling in the blanks, right. Which is how I think. Now, as far as that, so you can go to the Barnes Review and buy it from there. We have our credit cards back. I'm the senior researcher over there. They went bankrupt twice. I lost my job as editor. I became a professor at Mount St. Mary's in Maryland. And of course, they barely function, but they're still putting out a great publication. I'm very proud to be associated with them. They gave me my first job right out of grad school. I'd be nothing without this guy. So now the quote itself, Ivan IV was a great man. He was not a bloody man. He was not a violent man, but he came to power in a very, very difficult time. Like I said before, monarchs and nobles hate each other. The more powerful the noble class becomes, the more arrogant they become.
I see.
A monarch is concerned with the common good. The nobles, at their worst, are concerned with keeping the property that they have and getting more.
Right.
Now, there's always been good noble families. But by the time when Ivan was a kid, as that quote mentions, the big noble family, Shuisky was one of them. Cherkasy, there were so many of them. They had huge armies. Their armies were much bigger than the Muscovite army. They had navies if they had a shoreline. Wow. They were little countries. They had intelligence. They even sometimes had their own money. They were very, very powerful corporations. And Ivan was faced with a choice. Either I smash these people or Russia's finished. Because these guys were planning on many of them in the West were planning on making a deal with Poland, becoming Roman Catholic. And because Poland was a pure oligarchy. It was the purest oligarchy you can imagine. Well, the U.S. today is, but It's close to the U.S. It's almost American. It was a brutal oligarchy, the worst kind of serfdom you could think of.
Okay.
Feudalism, absolute worst was in Poland. So that's what Ivan dealt with, and he wasn't entirely successful. But he didn't execute that many people. He was a very merciful man.
Okay.
He should have been harsher than he was, but he just didn't have the resources. Uh-huh. His Oprichnina, at its height, had like 2,500 guys. They make it out to be this massive, secret police force. And what it was a elite force. And in Ivan's own sense, this was a dress rehearsal for Armageddon. And he saw it that way.
Okay.
And this was almost a religious order. Guys who were absolutely morally without spot to be his elite guard.
Right.
And they're the ones who were sent against some of these dominant and quite degenerate nobles.
Right. Okay.
In the city of Novgorod. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So we're jumping ahead in history a little bit. We will get back to Khazaria and the formation of it, but jumping in because what you just said about Poland being a gigantic oligarchy, you're talking in times where Jewish moneylenders and Jews pretty much ruled Poland and had total control of the nobility, and thus it made it hell on earth for the peasants in Poland.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the Catholic Church, was this a facade in Poland?
Look, there was no. I mean, Poland is a figure of speech. The monarch didn't have much power. They were essentially it was an interlocking set of fiefdoms. Is essentially what Poland was at the time. Nowhere else did the nobles want to destroy the monarchy more than Poland.
Really?
They would deliberately lose wars for the sake of
that's kind of like today.
Right? So what they would do is, in England and elsewhere, a monarch often came to power by building up city merchants and then taxing them.
Right.
Well, nobles said, this isn't going to happen. So they brought in Jews. This was a deliberate policy, starting in the 13th century onward.
Okay.
And these Jews functioned because they were given charters of immunity by the great noble families. They took over the cities. By the time of Khmelnytsky's rebellion against them in 1648, 90% of the world's Jewish population lived in the Polish Empire.
Right.
And it got so bad before Khmelnytsky overthrew them in that year, they thought the Messiah was coming. Because their rule was so overwhelming that it's got to be.
Yeah.
So the Catholic Church, it was a facade. Doesn't mean they weren't good Catholics. I'm not saying that. It's just
right.
It was a Judeo-oligarchic state. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, but the peasants were basically practiced Catholicism, and the Catholic Church kind of looked the other way, while the Jews manipulated the Polish peasants and the fiefdom.
It's hard to put it any other way.
Okay.
There always were good noble clans. There were always people.
They're not all evil. That's what I got from your book, Third Rome, is that it was pretty much a war between the monarchy and certain rebellious noble families who sometimes make leagues with outside countries, as you mentioned, Poland, and make trouble for the monarch. So the monarch was not under feudalism, this overarching dictator that a lot of these critics of feudalism portray him as, right? So
he had very little power. The authority was in the Sejm or the parliament that the noble families ran and controlled. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so the king, or in this case the Tsar, well, he did have the option of creating a secondary nobility, namely the military, who would be loyal to him and not to any feudal lords. How did that work out?
Well, I mentioned that was the Oprichnina.
That's okay.
That was his elite corps. Peter almost did the Antichrist does everything by inversion. Peter's new nobility was an inversion of Ivan's. It was the exact.
See. Okay.
These guys and under Ivan were there's a couple of nationalist groups out there called the Oprichnina. They call themselves that. They were black. They had the horses.
Okay.
They had brooms that they wore on their horses that had to be black. That were sweeping out of corruption.
Right. Okay.
And so that they were to go up against the standing armies of the noble clans. That's how big they were.
Right.
In Poland. And so if you're a noble in Russia, you look to Poland and you say, "Damn, I want that. Yeah. That's the life I want."
I see.
And so in that during the Renaissance in Europe, the Russian monarchs were desperate to make sure that didn't happen.
Okay. Yeah, because in your book you say that the nobles could have very hard times because they basically had to act as chief cook and bottle washer, dog catcher. They had to pay taxes. They had to make sure all the peasants were employed in producing food for not only for their fiefdom, but for the country as well. This often was a very, very difficult task, much harder on the nobles than on the monarchy, right?
Yeah, don't get the idea that in Russia, only with a handful of exceptions, the nobles were pretty much of the same class as the peasantry.
Okay.
There were no formal legal classes at the time.
I see.
Okay. These guys were military men who the monarch had to force to serve the country, and that's where they got their legitimacy from.
I see.
And they had a tough life.
Yeah,
they had peasants were able to, but these guys were always they were, and there was no bureaucracy. There was a handful of guys in Moscow. Policy was taken care of by these families, who all had their own standing armies.
I see.
And so again, you didn't really have any army that you would get in Russia was a noble muster. It wasn't until Ivan IV that created the first standing army in the country, because everything else was done locally.
Okay, so the chief obstacle to Russia's existence in these days was the hordes from Asia, right? So it would be in the nobles' interest, the monarchy's interest, the Russian Orthodox Church's interest for all of these nobles and their knights and their assistants to band together and make war against the invaders, right? That would keep the country together?
Well, first of all, we're going way back.
Okay.
The Mongol takeover was in the 13th century. So
well, we want to go back to 800. So let's backtrack. That's not a problem. So go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. When we talk about Western Europe, we're talking about the Carolingian era. We're talking about the Russian case, Ivan the Terrible. We're talking about the Renaissance. So it fits, but we have to make sure that we know what we're talking about when we say it.
Yeah.
I don't believe that the Mongols were Asian. There's no records of them being Asian.
Okay.
Absolutely not. I have article after article on this. In Russia itself, no one believes that. There's no records in Mongolia of any domination of Russia. There were very powerful Turkish tribes to the south, the Khazars being one.
Okay.
That caused nothing but trouble for the Russians, and this is during the Kievan era.
Mm-hmm.
It would be the High Middle Ages for us, and often serving at the behest of the Jewish or Italian bankers, and would go on slave raids. I think at their height, you had 3 million Slavs over that period of time taken from their homes by these hordes.
Right.
This is why smashing the Khazar Empire, smashing these, one tribe after another was absolutely they're artificially built up by Western power. But I don't want to get into the Mongol issue it's Asia. We're not an issue.
It brings up the Khazar situation because we know that around 840 AD, who was the Viking king that came down and smashed the Khazar kingdom? Do you remember what his name was? I think it's Ivan. Wasn't it Ivan?
He wasn't a Viking. Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Again, a whole new set of can of worms we're opening here.
Okay.
It was talking about Svetoslav was the first. Oleg was the one who finished it off.
Okay.
But by then there was almost very little Nordic blood in the in the elite class at the time. Only a very small number came in. There's questions about the Chronicle, how much we could trust it. But
okay.
The Khanate, we call the Khanate of Khazaria, was tremendously powerful, as you well know.
Uh-huh.
Oleg was defeated in 941, and because he had attacked them, the Khazars shut down the passages to the Volga, to the Black Sea. Big problem.
Okay.
Now the Byzantines and the Russians were able to find common ground against them. So and it was a system of extortion, essentially. So it was Oleg's successor, Svatoslav, who died in 972, who took Atil, which is the capital city, and razed it to the ground. But Svatoslav, Slav is right in his name, so there's no question about his background. Because even some of the so-called Normans or Vikings were Slavic anyway. But again, that's a whole separate issue. Right. But as I say in that article, here, and again, we're talking about the middle point of the Middle Ages, I guess you can say. Not quite to the first millennium. That Christendom, East and West, saw Khazaria as Gog and Magog. It was almost universal, and I don't think it really wasn't until the war in the Crimea, where Great Britain created a tremendous propaganda barrage, saying, "Oh no, that means Russia." And I still think people in the West who believe that today.
Yeah, most Judeo-Christians believe that. We know that's false. Even the Arabic scholars and the Muslim scholars later considered the Jews, the Khazars, to be Juj Majuj, that is Gog and Magog.
They were terrifying. Now they had no rules of war. There was no chivalry. They used Turkish nomads as their soul. They always had, they would never trust a local army. So they would always use mercenaries who were often paid by how much they could take. And, there was no rules on their behavior, and they ruled through terror. Mm-hmm. They were a wealthy place because their money comes from tolls that were charged on the Volga, which was a massive amount of money to these people. That's where they came from. Slavery, of course, was a big one.
Right.
Gog and Magog, this is an end times thing. And the smashing of the Khazars and the growth of Russian power south, this is a huge part of the Russian psyche, which is why the Russians have never trusted Jews, and which is why the Soviets needed to use such violence to impose their will on people. Right. But yes, you're absolutely right. But this is a British Crimean War propaganda effort. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now to your article in defense of the Khazar theory, which was published in the Barnes Review, the January-February issue of this year. You are quoting J.D. Barry, I believe. Oh, no. This is History of the Jews. Solomon Graso writes, one type of business carried on in the early Middle Ages by the Jews of Europe, namely the slave trade, requires a special word of explanation. The Jews were among the most important slave dealers. As inhabitants of Western Germany pushed their way deeper and deeper into Central Europe, driving the Slavic inhabitants further eastward and taking away their land, they brought back captives whom they sold to Jewish traders. The Jews in turn transported these slaves to other lands to be sold to Christian and Mohammedan masters. And then he says, Khazaria minted its own coins by the 830s, proving its economic dominance. The Turkic tribes in the Caucasus, such as the Murja and Chud, were approached by both Jews and the Russians. So this is just before, 830 is just before their conversion to Judaism. Take us through this area. What was going on here?
Well, you have a powerful empire that's come from a conglomeration of Turkic-type tribes over a very wide, mountainous area. Unity is a big problem. To become Islamic would mean that they would be subject to the caliphate somewhere else. To be Roman Catholic is obvious. They're connected to the Pope. To be Orthodox, they'd be under the Byzantine Emperor.
Right.
So Judaism made a lot of sense for them, especially since slavery was a part of the Talmudic theology.
Right.
For a slave trading empire, it's like music to their ears. And it just made a lot of sense to them, and it worked. And it took a while, but as you see, if you continue to read, you'll see that so many Arab foreign scholars say that the elite were 100% Jewish Talmudic, and of course this is where our modern Jews come from, because this was a huge, very wealthy, very powerful empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so we see there have been these conflicting theories. As far as I'm concerned, the Jews have been promoting the idea that the Ashkenazim are Israelites. We in Identity have always disputed that thesis because we know that they have Turkish blood, which we trace back to the Hittites. Hittite/Turkish blood, which the Hittites were the worst enemies of Israel in the old days, in biblical times. So these people have not one drop of Shemitic blood in them, yet they claim today to be Israel, and it's just a gigantic lie. So tell us how you came to sympathize with the Khazarian/non-Israelite identification.
Well, I mean, this is really it. There's one place where mainstream scholars will fully admit Jewish bad behavior.
Okay.
And that's in Khazaria, and then later on in Poland, which is the same group of people. You can't deny it. You can't deny how vicious they were. You can't deny that it was Judaic and that it was a great thing. Because it was purely, it was based on slavery and tolls. They produced nothing. There's no industry there. You had sheep farming, you had some agriculture, but everything was based on money, the actual money economy, which is, again, they coined their own money, which at the time was a sign of sovereignty and control. And because they went out of their way to reject any laws of war, they were terrifying. And when they came against you, you realized that, there was going to be no POWs.
Right.
And so you want to hit them, you have to destroy them. You have to hit them and hit them hard. And they were willing to lose money to punish anyone who tried to do so. So when they shut down the Volga, finally Byzantium and Moscow came together and were able to work on this.
Right.
But there was no way, given the radical differences in theology over the centuries, given the radical differences in just how they think and even how they appear, that the Israelites of the Old Testament have any connection with the Jewish dentist down the street from me. I mean, right. they would have to be stolen bread for that to be the case. And there's this explosion of a Jewish population right around this time in Central Europe. Well, there has to be an explanation for that.
Yeah.
Where they and
there was a lot of loving going on.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah, love and tolerance, you mean?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So they just all converted, which is what the obvious explanation of how the population exploded. Especially since they're semi-agricultural people. Even the Edomites back in the Old Testament, they were primarily sheep herders and cow grazers and that sort of thing. Not a whole lot of farming, but they were also traders. Right, the Canaanite, Edomite bloodline was primarily merchant bankers, even in the old days of the Bible, and they were very vicious people.
Well, they go together.
Yeah,
because I think this kind of buccaneer, that kind of merchant capitalism is just the battlefield, just put in a different arena. It's the same thing, and they viewed it that way. It was war. Yeah, and whatever they could get away with a bad, and when you're dealing with illiterate peasants, they took advantage, and they got hated real fast. They get kicked out of 120 city-states and countries over the centuries, all for the exact same thing.
Yeah,
usury, fraud, prostitution,
and brutality. When they can get away with it. Yeah.
And so you had other minorities who actually did very well, like Armenians, who were considered heretics, who were never harmed in any way. Arabs, from Syria, who were never harmed in any way. But they were fairly well-off minorities throughout Southern Europe. They were never harmed. And remember, when we say the expulsion of the Jews, Karaites were never touched. Because
the Karaites, those are the non-Jewish Samaritans. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, they rejected the Talmud.
Right.
And the Talmud has almost wiped them out. There's very few of them. And they have, of course, nothing to say to each other because they're two totally different religions.
Yeah.
From what I understand, the Karaites are decent, but there's so few of them.
Right.
Even in Spain, the so-called Spanish Inquisition, this is where the Talmud has destroyed the few Karaites that were there.
Right.
So you got very few of them left. But what I'm saying is, when you said Jew a couple hundred years ago, it meant Talmudist, someone who lives in the Kahal under a rabbi, under the head of the Kahal organization. It wasn't a Karaite, it wasn't a Samaritan, it wasn't anything like that. It was a very specific Turkish group of people. So we have to be very specific about that. And the Karaites were touched in these things.
Yeah, and the Ashkenazi are still that exact same group, that mixed group of mongrelized people who practice Talmudic Judaism. That hasn't changed at all since 840 AD, right?
I I actually read, believe it or not, in grad school, I read the Talmud from cover to cover, which was
really?
I do not recommend it.
Oh boy, no.
I do not recommend it. Well, I read it very quickly. A lot of it's boring. A lot of it I could just glaze over. But the stuff that wasn't boring, the obsession with, coming up with ways to get around the law, the obsession with sexuality, the obsession with women, young women, the obsession
and
with
little boys, right?
With fecal matter. It's bizarre. And this is why I said, no, this isn't. I don't remember seeing this in Leviticus.
Right.
So who are these people? It doesn't take long if you're willing to fight and tolerate what's going to be thrown at you. Half the time these Christian Zionists, so-called, I think they know. It's just there's so much money and respect in it for them. They have no interest in fighting it. And I think a lot of them are aware.
Yes.
They know they sell. Michael Hoffman has done such great work on this, all their magic charms and spells and everything else that they're into. Yeah, they can't not know this.
Yeah. Well, they're afraid. They would be, defrocked if they, tell the truth about the Jews. They would. The Jews control Christianity, modern Christianity. They totally control it.
I've been fired from every university I've ever taught in. I got my doctoral degrees because, I'm a nice guy. They liked me as a person. So when I talked about some of this stuff, they already liked me. So, that's Matt. He's just crazy.
But he's a nice, crazy guy.
That's exactly. And that's how I got through. Because you don't go on the first day and start Sieg Highland. But, you get to know people. You show that you're a nice guy. They show that you're honest and that you're agreeable. Mm-hmm. And, I'm still friends with these people.
Yeah.
My dissertation advisor was Jewish.
Wow.
And he knew exactly what I was doing. And, And,
okay.
Well, you're good at what you do, and you're a decent guy. So, I don't agree with you, but, that's how I got through.
Right. Yeah. Well, also these Jewish college professors and deans of Harvard and Yale, they realize that any really controversial material is never going to get mainstream publication, right? So that Jewish guy could be nice to you and say, you're doing great work, but he knows that it's not going to be a bestseller, right? He knows.
Exactly right. And then they could get to say, see how tolerant I am.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
When I got fired from St. Mary's, there was one person who defended me, and he was Jewish.
Okay.
A professor in the music department.
Interesting.
And he knew. I was completely honest with him. He read the Third Rome. Uh-huh. But he's a really nice guy. He said, "Look, this guy's a good teacher.
Yeah.
He's Roxy. He has more publications than any of us have. Come on. He's not out there in a brown shirt.
Right.
His students love him. What the hell's the matter with you guys? Well,
look what they did to Arthur Koestler after he published the 13th Tribe, exposing the fact that the Khazars are not Israelites, right? I mean, I think they murdered him.
Yeah, Koestler changed the world. I mean, that book was of such significance. I mean, unless you read Russian, Ukrainian, or Polish, that theory, you wouldn't know it. But Koestler brought that out of the East and made it mainstream. Oh, yeah, they wish he was never born.
Right. Well, Benjamin Friedman also talked about that, but he's much lesser known. And so he also wrote about the Khazars and the fact that they're not Israelites either. And there's encyclopedias that used to say that, but those articles have been deleted from the encyclopedic literature. Okay? But in the old world that we're talking about here, it was common knowledge that Gog Magog were the Jews, the Khazarian Jews. And the Khazars, even before they converted to Judaism, they were known as Gog and Magog. So this much is thoroughly established historically.
Read history books on any historical topic prior to 1900. And that's not that long ago.
No.
And their frame of reference is so radically different from ours. They say things that if we were to say them, or we do say them, we get in all kinds of trouble.
That's right.
And these were dons in major universities. World War II really was the watershed. But their frame of reference, their knowledge of this stuff, Jews being Khazars, that was day to day. Mm-hmm. And you get in trouble for saying that. But World War II, that was the watershed. And sometimes we forget just how radically different intellectually the world was.
Yes, understood.
In 1900. Yes. And how radical and how fast it was, and how quick we deleted this stuff.
pre-Zionist and pre-communist history, although not so much pre-communist, because there were a lot of communist revolutions locally in Europe in the 18th century. Once they took over Russia, communism became a really big deal. But on page 42 of this January-February issue, you say Benjamin of Tudela is another traveler who met with the Khazar nobility negotiating trade deals from Iraq. He is emphatic that Khazaria was a Jewish state. Are there any ancient travelers that say otherwise, to your knowledge?
I've never come across it. The closest are people who say, well, it was just the small, the most elite nobility.
Okay.
But then the problem is that implies that religion was a private matter like it is today. This is not how it worked back then.
No.
You didn't convert. You didn't. No. If your Lord converted, you converted, and there was nothing oppressive about that. That's just how it was. The commune was far more important than the individual. So that's all anachronistic. So even if the elite on top converted, well, that meant everyone did.
Yeah. Ultimately, they did. Yes.
Every burial site there has all kinds of Jewish traditions attached to it. I don't think there's been any that don't have it. Mm-hmm. So even down to the locals, they converted. But that's how you functioned. And so even if they could show that at a certain time was only a handful of elites, well, that's enough at the time. Yeah.
In the next paragraph, you quote Ibn Fadlan, a well-known Arab merchant and traveler in the 8th century, stated that, quote, the Khazars and their king are all Jews. The Bulgars and their neighbors are subject to him. They treat him with worshipful obedience. Some are of the opinion that Gog and Magog are the Khazars. There we go again. I mean, this seems to have been the universal judgment that Gog and Magog and the Khazars are identical.
The two big watersheds in our history concerning this stuff is the Crimean War, number one.
Okay, all right.
Where Western Europe essentially went to war with Russia over the Middle East, etc.
Yeah.
The British and the French, there was a propaganda barrage like you wouldn't believe. That's where all their Asiatic kind of stupid arguments come from. And then, of course, because Hitler, later on was very pro-Russian. He says it over and over again in his speeches that other than, the Bolsheviks aren't Russian. And he has very high opinion of them. I don't think the table talks are genuine. So in his speeches and what we can know are true writings, he was very pro-Russian. He wasn't like Himmler. So when he referred to, he would never refer to Russia as Bolshevik. He would refer to the Soviet Union, and he knew that they were Jews. So the defeat of Hitler meant that the world was divided between liberalism on the one hand and Marxism on the other hand.
Right.
And all kinds of nationalism were considered defeated and passé and everything else. And that's still the world we live in.
That's right. It's gotten worse. Anti-nationalism has gotten worse. Yeah, because both Bolshevism and finance capitalism are internationalist thrusts totally controlled by the Jews. So, if
very similar.
Yeah, if we don't figure out a way to combat this pincer action against the West, we're doomed. Right, because so few people are capable of having the discussion that you and I are having about Jewish influence in both of these spheres. Okay, for example, the college students that have been indoctrinated by their Marxist professors don't realize that they are actually working for the Rothschilds who've been financing communism for the last couple of centuries. Right? They don't understand that.
One of the worst things, when I was in college and grad school, this is all I did. I was obsessed with this stuff. I lived and breathed it. Mm-hmm. Going over the ancient text, going over the modern text, reading speeches and translating and everything else. Obsessed with building arguments and making sure that I had every T crossed, every I dotted. And then I get out to the real world and realize that truth isn't that important.
Yeah.
Truth is an abstraction.
Right.
People want to hear what they want to hear. People want to hear what's convenient. And, when you start talking like I do, I've lost so many friends. I don't give a damn anymore.
Yeah.
You reach a point, you cross the Rubicon, it doesn't make any difference. But there's a fear. They'll whisper to you that of course you're right.
Fear. Yeah.
It's absolutely fear. And you know what they'll do my friend Dan Cleve, my alma mater, University of Nebraska, what they did to him when they found out that he was at Charlottesville. His education's finished. Yeah. I don't know if you remember that story from a couple of years ago.
I remember Charlottesville. I don't remember his story particularly. Maybe if you want to go into it, go ahead.
Well, no, just very briefly, because I was in Charlottesville. I went blind for 3 days because I got sprayed.
I didn't realize that happened to you. Wow.
Oh, you didn't know? Oh, yeah. My son and I were. My son was young at the time, but he was a medic, and he really, was very, very solid under fire.
Okay.
We were sprayed with bear mace, and I had it.
Whoa.
And it's a gel that attaches to the eye, and it was awful, and it's not mace, and it took I was blind for, it was 3 days, and I had to go to the ER. They washed it out. They said, damn, this whoever, they were saturating the air with it. Not a cop in sight, Anyway, in Nebraska is where I got my PhD. I taught there for a few years, and Dan Cleve was a biology student there. They found out somehow that he was at Charlottesville. There's a picture of him, and the entire campus came down on him.
Oh, man.
The basketball team was wearing T-shirts, all of them, condemning him before it was in every newspaper.
Yeah.
And the university said, we can't guarantee your safety here. They were,
right.
He was over. Being biology, he needs labs. He has to be there physically.
Sure.
And I wrote, because it's my alma mater, I'm an alumni. I have a certain right. They wouldn't publish any of my letters. I wasn't very nice about it. I contacted a bunch of alumni. I said, this is outrageous. I know a few state senators from the area. No one wants to touch it.
Right.
I said, this guy is all alone. And I wrote him and I said, I've been where you are. Thank God there was no internet at the time at the University of Hartford. And I know how terrifying this is. As far as I know, he still hasn't gone back to school. It's died down now. But and people know this. Professors see this. Students see this. This is what happens if you said, and all there was a picture of him marching there. There's no swastikas or anything. Nothing like that there. And this is the entire campus. You had Jews who worked the student newspapers saying, I'm terrified of coming to campus because Dan is here. These ridiculous, over the top kinds of things. So
right. Yeah.
That's the fear.
Well, one white supremacist holding the entire university hostage. Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's exactly what I said. I said, you guys are got to be kidding me with this. Now, I can only hope that there's a lot of white students there who know and would say, oh, this is disgusting. They can't say anything. Sure. But one day they will. The economy collapses, which has got to happen very soon. I mean, it's in the process anyway. When there's no money to be had for these people, where are they going to go? They're going to know what the truth is. They have nothing to lose now.
Yeah.
And that's really the only hope we have.
Yes.
But thanks to the internet, people what do we do without the internet? What the heck? We didn't know anything.
Yeah.
But but there are Jews. There's Khazaria.org, which is a Jewish site that really says Khazaria is our home. So you have some of them who are quite honest about it.
Yeah, even Netanyahu said that. Netanyahu said that.
Hebrew almost died. Hebrew was almost a dead language. Yiddish isn't related to Hebrew.
No.
Foreign language. Who are these people? And how do these people not be able to figure out that the two languages are unrelated?
Yeah, it's German and Slavic. That's what Yiddish is.
Yeah, with a heavy Turkish influence too.
Right.
These people out there who never heard of the Talmud before, and they claim to be theologians.
Yeah. Okay, so on the same page 42, in the third column, by the 880s, Khazar control over the Dnieper from Kiev, where they collected tribute from the Slavs, began to weaken substantially. Oleg of Novgorod took control from Askold and Dir, and hence laid the foundation of our modern idea of Kievan Rus. Southern raiding of the Rus was even permitted by the Khazars only if they turned over 50% of the take with their Jewish betters. It served both their interests because it permitted the Muslim Arabs and the Rus to fight each other, leaving the Khazars as well-off middlemen now safe from attack. Now, isn't that convenient? They do that the same today. Back to you.
Exactly. The exact same thing. This can't be a coincidence. It shows you the diabolical brilliance here.
Oh, man, it is brilliant.
And I did say that these Turkish tribes in the south, so much of Russia's mentality was to control its borders, especially its southern border.
Right.
I mean, she's surrounded by enemies, and this is why the monarchy just had to develop as a centralized institution, which Kievan Rus never had. And after the Mongol attack and takeover, so we don't get into whether Asiatic or not is not the issue, but they took over, and then once they began to wane, they needed to completely rebuild a new Russian world centralized in Moscow. They simply had no choice.
Okay.
Because the centralized system in Kievan Rus was not sufficient.
Yes.
But a place like Khazaria had no real unity. The Talmud, there's no brotherhood.
There's warlords.
Yeah. No brotherhood in the Talmud. It's there to justify slavery and to maintain their independence. That's really what it came down to.
Yeah.
And so they had a lot of cracks in that system. And you had two powerful societies, Greek and Slavic, now having enough of them. They pushed too hard, as they always do. And finally, Svetoslav destroyed them in 968. And they scattered, and mostly to Central Europe.
Okay. All right. Now, most of our listeners know the story of how, and you mentioned it briefly earlier, about how the Bulan had to choose among three religions. Orthodox Christianity, Russian version.
You mean Vladimir?
Islam and Judaism. Okay, those were the three choices. And they chose Judaism because to avoid making enemies with either of the other two sides. Where does Byzantium fit in here?
Well, you're getting it a little bit mixed up. That's Saint Vladimir, the enlightener of Russia, had that three religion thing. Bulan was, that's where that story comes. Now it's a stylized story. It's not literally true, but it's very true in another.
Okay, well, please explain, because I'm not sure what you mean that Vladimir had that three religion game going.
Well, in the primary chronicle, it tells a story of the pagan worlds. Again, there was no unity there. It was a decentralized society. Uh-huh. He knew that these tribes were going to eat them up alive unless they joined together. They needed this. They wanted to be part of civilization.
Okay. And
you had one of the three. You had Islamic civilization, you had the Khazars, and you had two different, and this was prior to the schism between East and West. So the Greek.
Oh, prior to.
Yeah, the schism wasn't until roughly 1100. So, 1054 to 1100.
At least up in that area. Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So
I see.
But still, there was a big difference between the Greeks and the Latins, Romans. Mm-hmm. And it really came from Bulgaria. Is where the Slavic Orthodox came into Russia from.
Okay.
But they were under the Byzantine suzerainty anyway.
Yes. Okay.
So it's a stylized story, but the concept is just like the Khazars. And actually, Saint Vladimir actually was convinced by Orthodoxy because he completely changed his life. He stopped. His harem, he dismissed. He fed the poor from his own table. He had homeless in his palace. He really went all out, and he really had to fear God. So this was a legitimate conversion.
He became a Christian.
He was terrified. He didn't want to use capital punishment because he was afraid that this was against the faith. And so the Patriarch of Constantinople wrote him and says, well, under certain circumstances, it's okay. The point is, that's how scrupulous he was.
Wow. Okay, that's very interesting. So, in other words, the Russian Orthodox Church migrated from Byzantium through Bulgaria, and and how did it relate to Rome up in Russia? Because Poland was Catholic, Roman Catholic, and then Romania, of course. So there must have been some tension between the Roman Catholics and the Russian Orthodox people.
Oh, of course. I mean, this was the fault line in Europe. Uh-huh. Serbia, Croatia, Poland, Russia. These were bitter rivalries. Poland is such an outlier because even though it was a Catholic society, it had this bizarre social system that led to its total destruction in the 1770s. But Rome, is not a place. It's the concept of order, the concept of natural law, a legitimate liberty under law. And, the third Rome is the concept of the true faith, true civilization. And if you know the Talmud very well, you know one place that gets just raked over the coals is Rome. They despise the notion of this Gentile, powerful civilization based on this high intellectual achievement and high-tech military and everything else. They loathed it. They despised it.
Right.
And they never built it themselves anywhere. Khazaria would be the closest thing. And so they envied it. They hated it. Right. And so after, Byzantium fell in 1453, and it was taken over by Islam, Russia found itself as the only independent Orthodox country in the world.
Wow.
And so it completely altered their personality. They realized now we have a tremendous responsibility.
Right.
Surrounded by enemies.
Against Islam and the Jews.
and Roman Catholics, unfortunately.
Yeah, and Roman Catholics.
And they fought each other all over the place. So the Russian psyche developed because of this.
Okay,
needing
understood.
To create a centralized institution, being surrounded by enemies. Everything is the common good, common good, common good. And that's why the nobility, concerned with their own money, was so distasteful. And, of course, we have the oligarchs starting roughly in 1991 who took over almost all Jewish except for, like, Patan. I don't think he's the only one.
Okay.
All Jewish. And so the same thing develops again. The same kind of Khazaria. I know, of course, as you know, I've written elsewhere that the Jews in Ukraine actually call themselves New Khazaria.
Right.
Have their whole institution that way. I did a whole broadcast on it. It's a long story. But
Ukraine was taken over by the Jews during that putsch, 4 or 5 years ago? It was taken away from the Ukrainian people, and the Jews took it over.
It was absolutely disgusting what happened there.
Yes, totally disgusting.
I was going through a divorce at the time, and my phone was ringing off the hook, and I wasn't really taking calls, and so I wasn't in the thick of it like I was supposed to be.
Yeah.
But these people were just making stuff up.
Right.
Fox News didn't know.
I'll never forget that video. A really beautiful Slavic-looking woman with light red lipstick saying, "We are Ukrainia." And it was the production of that video was so perfect. I said to myself, whoever produced this video had millions of dollars at his disposal. This was not a locally produced video. Sure enough, I find out it was produced by an American Jew.
Absolutely. Ukraine is so heartbreaking because they're the most educated population on the planet. More advanced degrees per capita than anywhere else. Very high IQ.
Wow.
It was only the agricultural center of Russia, but the high-tech center of Russia and the industrial center of Russia turned into now what can only be considered a fourth world backwater.
Right.
The IMF compares Ukraine with Ghana and Mali in terms of its economic system. It functions entirely by American aid. The currency is worthless.
Right. Yeah.
And the whole thing came about because I have paper after paper I wrote on this finally, is that, these guys were deeply in debt. And the only way they can get out of this is to make a deal with the West, finance us to take over and we'll sell you essentially the economy piece by piece.
Jeez.
Before that rebellion, and it's a shame because I like Yanukovych. He's not, but he's all right. He sold off the two sides of Ukraine, East and West, one to Shell, the other to Exxon, giving them. He sold. They full police powers.
Both owned by the Rothschilds.
Yeah, it was a fracking operation. They actually had. I've read the contracts in the original. They had the ability to take water because fracking takes so much water.
Yeah.
From any place in Ukraine they needed.
Jeez.
And they had full police powers. In fact, there was no money. Selling off the country, literally selling off not figuratively, literally selling off the country was the only way that they were able to stay afloat. And even that failed.
Yeah.
And yet you have the example of Belarus and Russia that have succeeded and reversed all that. Ukraine would have even been better off had it been properly. And that's the heartbreak here because people really are starving.
Yeah. Okay, so you summarize, again on page 42, as Kiev grew in strength, its leadership attacked the Khanate more than once. Oleg was defeated in 941. Soon after, the Khazars shut down passage through the Volga to the sea. The reason for this are the Byzantines and Rus were finding common ground against the Khazars. They knew all-out war was coming. Even local tribes such as the Pechenegs were slowly being brought into the Byzantine orbit. Okay, so this was probably the only time, although, the Byzantines then were defeated by the Turkish Arabs, right? The Turkish Muslims, correct?
Not at this time.
Not at this time.
That was centuries away. That's 1453.
Oh, that was later. Oh, okay. But they were attacked.
They were always under attack, though.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I understand even there, the Jews assisted the Turks in overthrowing the Byzantine Empire. Okay.
Oh, everywhere. Yeah. Islam is Judaism for Gentiles.
Yeah.
And it's always functioned that way. It's
we call it Jewslam. We call it Jewslam.
There's no question about it. It's organized the same way. Yeah, there's no question about it.
Yeah. Okay, so how we have all these Khazarian Ashkenazi Jews in Khazaria. What drove them or attracted them to Poland? How did that work out?
Well, we hinted at it briefly a little while ago. The nobility in Poland facing this kind of onrush of these Khazars who had money, who had experience, who did have experience running a country and running trade routes and everything else. They didn't. The Polish nobles were generally illiterate, and in other words, they didn't speak Greek or Latin. They weren't really cultured, especially at the mid and lower levels. The Jews were the perfect way to take over the cities so that the monarch can't have it. And they functioned. On the one hand, the Jews were given immunities by noble clans.
All right.
So their legitimacy came from there. And at the same time, the noble clans are getting a big chunk of their huge income. And,
So it's like the old song, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen Paris? So the Jews brought cosmopolitanism to Poland, and it just kind of overpowered the nobility of Poland to the extent that it was a nobility. To what extent was it a nobility? You're saying they were pretty poor.
Well, no. I mean, the Slots or the Sejm was the parliament, which is where the oligarchs assembled to pass laws. Every once in a while, the monarch, especially if he won a big battle, like Jan Casimir, people like this, would gain power. That would always, they would withhold funds and allow the Turks to defeat an army if it meant, because they didn't want the king to have any power. They didn't care. They'd give the whole country over. Yeah. If it meant keep their feet. And this was the whole issue.
Yeah, this was I found stunning in your book, The Third Rome, that the nobility would conspire against the monarch if they didn't like him. What kind of country is that?
Well, that was pretty much everywhere. There are two different groups of people. Yeah, the monarchy is about the common good, and it's always very religious. And the nobles, as a class, are about their own personal good. And so it always was this back and forth seesaw battle. And the great victory of the czars, starting from Ivan III onward, was to be able to get enough of an income to build this nobility that was loyal to them and that really was willing to fight for the sake of the common good. And for the most part, it worked, unless you had an interregnum like you had prior to Ivan IV, and he was just a kid. And the minute you give them an inch, and they would run with it. But when they came under control, they were self-sacrificial, and these guys had a rough life. But in Poland, it was a military nobility. But the Jews solved the problem. How do we keep the king from having any real income? We have bringing in a very powerful, wealthy group of people who depend on us, because everyone hated them. Mm-hmm. So being protected by us is really important. So they depended on us. We're dependent on them. We become wealthy beyond, the rich ones became wealthy because from taxing these guys. Right. They up the churches. They had a full monopoly on alcohol, which of course was a big thing with them. Right. And they were the tax farmers. And they collected the tax. The tax farm is a private organization, the Kahal, that would, they're given a certain quota amount that they have to raise. Any penny above that, they get to keep. So that means they have every incentive to lie, to steal, to do whatever they can to take more than what they're supposed to. That's how they got paid.
Right. Okay, so that they make this arrangement with the monarch also, or is it primarily with the local lords?
No, this is strictly a local matter.
Okay.
Monarchs never trusted them. Monarchs were aware of it.
Okay.
But starting in the High Middle Ages when this first happened, the money was flowing in. The Jews had this international organization.
Yes.
They kept all this money. That means that they could charge much lower rates than everybody else.
Right.
They always had this advantage. They spoke a language no one else did. They had the tremendous solidarity from one city. I mean, you had Antwerp. You had, after the fall of Constantinople, you had Byzantium. Krakow was the main center in Poland. And for a while, you had Spain. And then, of course, London, after the William of Orange came in. So you had this huge network with a huge amount of money that they kept to themselves. And when you made a deal with them, you knew you were going to get a far, far lower rate of interest than you'd get anywhere else.
Right.
And that's how they brought you in.
Yeah.
And this is how they did it. I mean, they offered something, but the way they dealt with the peasantry is really where they failed completely. Mm-hmm. And that's what they I have an article, it's kind of a separate issue. A long time ago, it's published on my website. Oh, by the way, I should mention this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Russjournal.org, Rus Journal, RUS.org, and it has everything of mine, all my articles. The radio show will send you to Radio Aryan, where I broadcast from.
Okay.
All my Radio books are there.
Okay.
Yeah, Radio Aryan is Sven Longshanks. He's my producer. He's a close friend of mine.
Ah, okay.
And yeah, he's one of the good ones. I trust him.
Yeah.
So I want to, and there's a donation button on there because being independent costs. I don't have a university. I don't have a think tank. It's all my friends. That's how I function.
All right. So it seems like Poland was really the first, how should I put this, debt slave nation created by the Jews. And this debt slave nation slowly migrated its way west, although we do have Spain. Spain was a little bit different because those were Sephardic Jews. Those were Sephardic Jews in league with the Berber Muslims, okay, that across not the channel, the Straits of Gibraltar, right. And they conspired against the Visigoths of Spain, and overthrew the Visigoths. Now, those were Sephardic Jews, but they're not Israelites either. They also stem. Yeah. Go ahead.
That distinction, I used to make a big deal of that distinction. I really don't anymore.
Okay.
I mean, they could be rivals, but they're with respect. Rabbis are treated with respect in Israel and everything else. So that distinction is not that big of a deal. It can matter, but they're on the same side.
Right. Well, what's his name? Bernstein, I think his name. He wrote a book, My Life in Racist Marxist Israel. Yeah. He was a Sephardic Jew, and he says he was very much discriminated against by the Ashkenazim. That the Ashkenazim were really the power brokers, and Sephardics didn't count. Probably by this time, this was in the 1960s, all right, probably by this time there is no difference anymore. The Ashkenazim have pretty much overwhelmed the Sephardics by this time, so I would agree there probably isn't much difference anymore.
Yeah, the chief rabbi of Israel was Sephardic. Okay. Sometime, it's not, of course there's going to be rivalry, but the way that the Kahal functioned, you had this elite group of rabbis who kept all the money, and you did have poor families under them. Mm-hmm. How did they keep them loyal? And E. Michael Jones mentions this. I've been talking about this for years. The depiction, they're completely closed society. The depiction of Gentiles as animals. Mm-hmm. Ravenous psychopaths that would kill us for no reason, just because they hate us for no reason. And this is how they maintain this loyalty. They don't speak the local language. There's no way for them to get any outside information. The so-called Enlightenment broke the power of the Kahal for a while.
Yeah.
But that's a separate issue. But The Kahal system is how they ruled. And this is what maintained the loyalty of poor Jews. Right. And this is where the so-called solidarity comes from, years and generation after generation of saying that if you leave us, if you go to them, they're going to kill you.
We'll disown you on top of it, right? Of course, there are a lot of poor Jews in Poland and Russia as well, but they weren't really that horribly badly off because they always could go to their local rich Jew friend, and get a handout. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah. They were poor, but yeah, they were all part of the community,
right?
And and they needed, they needed the occasional anti-Jewish riot to keep people away.
There you go. So they needed the Unterjuden to be sacrificial lambs that they could say, "Oh, we poor Jews, we're so persecuted." And sometimes they would stage those riots themselves. The Oberjuden would sacrifice the Unterjuden on many occasions.
Now, I've spent quite a bit of time on debunking the myth of the pogroms in Russia.
Right.
I can say early 20th century. Overwhelmingly, people forget that these Jews were heavily armed. There were no gun laws in Russia at the time. These Jewish centers, the Jakubinsky organization and everything else, they had heavy weapons.
Right.
Odessa, for example, the Jewish capital of Ukraine, Russian Empire at the time.
Right.
The mayor was not only a Jew but a communist for a long time. They had weaponry. They usually fought. They usually fired first.
Yeah. Okay.
It's the same procedure. They need this kind of stuff. They need violence, just like Israel needs violence to maintain the spigot to Washington, D.C.
Right. Okay, in about 10 minutes, I'm expecting Daryl from Missouri to call in. If he doesn't, are you able to, carry on for the balance of the show?
What's the balance of the show?
Yeah, we're approaching the 90-minute mark, and but we're live for 2 hours. Okay.
Oh, no, I'll keep it at 90 minutes if you don't mind.
Oh, okay, all right.
So the only thing I want to do is just to let your listeners know that to go on my site if you have. If you like what I'm saying, support what I'm saying, please help out. Okay. My divorce almost killed me. Right. I'm not kidding.
Yeah. So give us your contact information again before you leave. Okay, the various websites that you're affiliated with.
Well, I mentioned Rus Journal. That's the main one for me.
Rus Journal. Okay.
Yeah. RUSjournal.org.
.org.
And that was set up by Matt Parrott a long time ago. These are the guys that kind of brought me out of my doldrums.
Okay.
Around 2014. That's the first thing. The second, of course, is Radio Aryan. Okay. We're not competitors in any way with Eurofolk. We're allies and we're friends.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's how it's always going to be. I don't think anyone thinks that. I just want to let you know.
Right.
That's how we view.
No, I mean
we're all going to be in the same gulag.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, my definition of a friend and a brother is someone who has a very good chance of sharing a gulag cell with me.
Right. Too good
That's
a
my
chance.
Definition.
Too good
That's
a
my
chance.
Definition of
Right.
And if you fall into that category, then you're a brother of mine. So my Skype is Saint Sava. That is ST_SAVA. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay.
And this is all I do. I'm full time. I've been doing this now, almost 30 years, writing, translating, constant study, broadcasting, interviews, travel, everything else. I do nothing else. I'm incapable. I'm good at two things. I'm good at, number one, historical analysis, and number two, making very attractive babies.
Yeah, okay, and making enemies of the Jews. I'm sure that.
Well, my kids are, they're in college. They're on our side, thank God. And let me tell you a quick story. When they came back, they had to go to the Holocaust Museum from school. I didn't say a word. I was not going to bias. This was a long time ago. They were little. My son came home and said, "Damn, I hate these people."
Outstanding.
And I said, Gabriel, what do you mean? He said, all they did was attack Christians.
Right.
Of course, all they did, it was so controlled. It's like you start from the top and you go down. Everything. It's like a museum.
Christianity for the hoax. Yeah, exactly.
And he said it was so. Basically, both my kids, and they both came back saying it was so over the top they so overstated their case. It was just overwhelming, saying things over and over again.
Right.
And they were making fun of them on the bus on the way home.
Very good. Very good.
And I have the feeling that that's not just them. I think that's very, very common. And I thank God I moved my family to a very conservative area.
Yeah.
In central Pennsylvania. We don't have to worry about much. But that's exactly what happened. They overplayed their hand.